Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially because it is the Roosevelt Library, and I couldn't have finished my book if I didn't have the Roosevelt Archives and the help of great archivists who know where material is and are willing to help you find it. It took 4 years for Americans to fight and win World War II, but they've never stopped talking about it since 1945. So I predict and suspect that the conversation is going to go on for many more years. And that sort of interests me as a historian, that we spend more time talking and interpreting these events than the events themselves. And so that particular question or that particular issue caused me to think about and think more about what Americans understood about World War II, how they understood it, and how they understood it over time. Now, I'm going to make a few general points today, and then I'll sort of take you hopping and skipping through some memorials and through some movies and through some novels and anything else you want to do. And later you can ask questions and tell me what I didn't talk about, and maybe we can talk about that. The first point I want to make, and the first generalization, is this. We talk about World War II today, and we talk about it a lot. In your own recent years, you've all watched the PBS series, and you've all went out and bought Tom Brokaw's book, and you all saw and read the works by historians like Ambrose, and the movies like Saving Private Ryan. And in fact, it's been incredible how much World War II has been with us over the last 15 or 20 years. The point I want to make is this, that the way we primarily talk about World War II today is not the way that the generation that fought the war talked about it in the 1940s and the 1950s. There's some similarity in our current and contemporary conversation, but there are distinct differences, and I want to look a little bit more at those differences today and maybe suggest why those changes and that change has taken place. The other thing that struck me in looking at the way Americans remember the war, not so much the war itself, was that there was wide disagreements. There were a lot of issues, and that's to be expected. When we talk today and refer to World War II as a good war fought by the greatest generation, we sort of minimize and reduce the complexity in all the various perspectives and attitudes and feelings people had. I mean, what would you expect? You've got 140 million people thrown into probably the most violent struggle in human history. Do you think that they all sat back in 1946 and said, we're the greatest generation that fought the good war? Or do you think there were issues? And in that sort of statement is a historical trajectory or a historical pattern where that complexity becomes narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to a greater extent over time. And because we're at the Roosevelt Library today, I want to say something about Franklin Roosevelt's place in the public perception and understanding about World War II, because it changed, and it changed over time, and because FDR had a very specific argument of why we had to fight World War II. I think I'll be suggesting near the end of my remarks today that we talk and continue to talk much less about Roosevelt's specific argument about why the war was necessary than was talked about in the 40s and the 50s, especially after he died by his widow, Eleanor Roosevelt. The problem with remembering war, and there are many, but a key problem is this. You need to mobilize power, and you need to engage in massive amounts of state-sponsored killing to win a war. That's what Robert McNamara would say in The Fog of War, if you bother to sit down and look at that. That's what sort of was alluded to earlier in the talk earlier this morning about Eisenhower's approach to the war. I mean, look, you're going to win, you're going to lose. If you want to win, you better be ready to fight the fight. And so we did. Absolutely did. But you can't get away from the fact that if you're going to win the damn thing, and you're going to engage in mass killing, at some point, you're going to have people, your own citizens, your own soldiers, loved ones, thinking about whether the cost was worth it. The cost of losing a son, or the cost of losing a spouse, or the cost of losing an arm, or the cost of losing a leg. There will be those who will stand proudly and say, I sacrificed a body part and I did my bit. Absolutely. People took pride, that they were honored by their sacrifice, and others felt their sacrifice was extremely honorable. That was true in the 40s, that's true today in the global war on terror. But no one sitting here listening to me right now would say that there are those people who don't walk away from that experience with regret. And there are not those people who will suffer for the rest of their lives, whether it's a combat vet or a grieving spouse or a grieving mother or a Gold Star mother. And so there's always a tension in any nation, and in this nation, throughout the 20th century especially, between a virtuous view of the war. We fought the good war, we were patriotic citizens, we did what we have to do, we defeated Hitler and evil in the world, and God knows if there were ever was evil in the world, it was represented in the form of Hitler and National Socialism. But there are those people who didn't so readily buy into that memory, that particular story. And so that struggle and many other issues continues and continued long after the war was over. I would suggest in doing the book that there were three main ways, I have to simplify here to an extent, in which Americans remembered World War II, even as it was being fought, as they understood it. One was a highly traditional way, that it was a patriotic war, we were defeating evil in the world, that our losses were justified because the end result was noble, that the killings that we had to engineer may have been regrettable, but were necessary. And something that really came out late in the 20th century strongly was that war builds character. I mean, that's the essence of The Greatest Generation in Brokaw's book, that people gained, Ambrose too, that people came out of the war stronger than they went in. It built virtue, it built ethics, they became good, hardworking people out of that experience. The other version of World War II that was prominent, especially before the 60s, was a more critical version, or what I call a critical version. And that version didn't accept readily that all the sacrifice was worth it on our part, and that all the killing we had to engage in was necessary. Now, we don't hear that a lot today about World War II, but it was widespread in the 40s and 50s and in the 20 or 25 years after the war, especially among those that fought that war. And finally, and then I'll work my way through these various approaches, you had Roosevelt's approach to the war. And Franklin Roosevelt, he gave it to the people early on, even before Pearl Harbor. In his address to Congress in January 41, before Pearl Harbor, because Roosevelt, those of you who know Roosevelt and that history, know that he was thinking quite a bit about Hitler, about Hitler's expansion in Europe especially, and about how to stop it. In a time when, as you also know, millions of Americans had no interest at all in getting involved in this thing. That was the furthest thing from their mind. But Roosevelt was on top of it from a very early period. And in January 41, before Pearl Harbor, he says, if we have to fight, essentially, there's only one way it can be justified, and that is that we fight and we achieve and we realize for the entire world the four freedoms. There's a display on the four freedoms as you walk down the hallway here today into this room. The four freedoms were basically human rights, not just for Americans, but for every man and woman everywhere. So that everyone have freedom of speech and freedom from fear and freedom of religion. And the one that really got him in trouble with conservatives, freedom from want. Ooh. Here's a signal of what's coming later. You're not going to read much about freedom from want in Ambrose and Brokaw. So